Why is it that people who rigorously follow scientific studies, who always do what's the most optimal movements, why do those people always tend to end up really skinny, not making too much progress, whereas people like me are able to add significant amounts of muscle and see significant progress in the gym? Let me break it down for you. So first of all, what is science? So science is the study of, the structure of the world or the behavior of the world through observation and experiments. So science is basically we try to understand something through experiments. The thing about scientific experiments is that it does not replicate the real world. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't even come close. So why is that? Well, in science, in a scientific experiment, you can never account for all of the variables that actually are represented in reality. You can try to do your best to account for some. In scientific study, a lot of times they try to actually specifically isolate certain variables. However, in isolating certain variables, you either restrict or you even fail to account for several others. A scientific experiment can never fully replicate reality. And in fact, when it comes to, scientific experiments, when it comes to bodybuilding specifically, I find that a lot of these experiments are not even close. They'll use people such as beginners, or they'll use people who, weren't really disciplined and regimented before. Now they are. So of course, the study's not going to be reflective of reality. There's a million things that can be different with the experiment compared to reality. There's always variables that you cannot account for. Number 2 is biases. So we learned this in science class in high school. Like we learned about, biases. There's a whole list of them. I can't even go over all of them, but there's so many different biases that come into effect when it comes to scientific experiments. There's some that are very obvious, such as, maybe the person who's in charge of the experiment, you can kind of tell they want to see a certain outcome. So that affects the participants. There's also biases that, are very, very subtle, but they still play a big impact. So biases largely affect the scientific experiment. They play a huge role. We were all taught these things, in high school. We were taught media literacy, don't trust studies. You have to understand, how studies are performed and what they mean. So you need to know that yourself as well. And then number 3 is if someone wants to find a study about a certain topic, they can find it, or they can fund it at least. If I wanted to find a study about how cotton candy is good for your teeth, I can do that. I can figure out a way, find the person to isolate the right variables, to find the right metrics, to prove that cotton candy is good for your teeth. It doesn't really mean that it's true. If you wanted to find a study that says doing 3 reps is the most optimal rep range for hypertrophy, you could find that study. There are studies out there that say that 3 reps is optimal. There's studies out there that say 40 reps is optimal. Both of them aren't true. Are you fucking retarded? 3 reps for hypertrophy. But there are studies out there because, they isolate the correct variables in order to support their findings. Just the other day, I had someone DM me on Reddit saying, because I was talking about optimal rep range, someone asked a question, so I answered. And then someone else DM'd me like, this is wrong. You look at this study, you need to learn something. There's always going to be a study that's, going to contradict common advice, that's going to support if you want to find a study that supports a lot of people want to do 6 to 8 reps. There's a lot of studies that are going to support that. That doesn't mean that it's the best way to train, especially if you want muscle growth. So you have to realize when it comes to science, you have to understand what exactly you're looking at. You're looking at an experiment. You're not looking at, God came down and said, this is the fact of things. Or like someone waved the magic wand and said, okay, whoever does this wins, whoever doesn't do this loses. It's not like that. It's just an experiment. It's observations. There's biases that come into effect. There's variables that get, restricted. There's variables that we don't account for. Science is not exact. Yes, science can be accurate a lot of the times. And, there's times and places to use that. But, when it comes to, conventional bodybuilding, if you look at, the old school bodybuilders, they were so much better. They're just so much better than modern day bodybuilders. They're so much bigger. They're so much more muscular. All of their methods, there's no reason to change any of them. Yet everyone wants to do things differently now. Everyone wants to do something different, more optimal. They don't want to do the hard work. And the reality is, they want to find a way to, hack their way into the results. They're too soft in order to actually do the amount of reps they need to do the amount of volume, put in the amount of intensity. They're just too soft. They can't put themselves through it. So they need to find a study that tells them that there's an easier way around it. So if you've watched this far and you're wondering, what to do next, what to do in order to see success, what should you do? So the first thing is do what's worked in the past. Follow the conventional methods. Follow, what all those old school bodybuilders did, their training methods, their techniques. Obviously not exactly, the professional bodybuilders who were on steroids, but look at someone who maybe was jacked or like has a physique that you want to achieve. Look at that person and see what they did in order to get to that point. Number 2 is use your common sense and your logical brain. If someone's saying 3 reps is optimal for muscular hypertrophy, don't be a fucking retard. Your logical brain and your common sense should trump over what is scientific, what's scientifically proven. If someone says something really crazy, like do 15 sets of bench press every bench press session, you have to think like, okay, maybe that's a scientific study, but why is that? What do they not talk about? What do they leave out? Is this really a smart thing to do? You have to kind of use your common sense and your logical brain to kind of figure out a way around, some of these traps. 3 is don't be so gullible. So like, everyone's always going to come up with a new study. There's always going to be some random person telling you this is what to do. You have to understand who is telling you this, why they're telling you this, and, is it actually smart, or is it something that maybe you should probably ignore or just take with a grain of salt? There's so much information, so you actually do need to filter out a lot of garbage. Number 4, don't be afraid to do any of the hard work. So a lot of people, they want to, change their methods. They want to find something that's more optimal because they're afraid of doing the hard work. Let me give you an example. So many of my friends, they always want to do, shorter rep ranges. They always want to stay in like, the 6 to 8 rep range. I keep telling them, this is not optimal. Like even if you train close to failure, you're just not going to see the same growth as if you did 10 to 12. But, they resist it a lot. And the reason they're resisting is because, deep down inside, they know that it's going to be so much harder. It's going to be so much more uncomfortable to train, 10 to 12 reps than it is to do only 6 to 8. And so, that's why they're resisting it. They want it to be 6 to 8. They want the truth to be easier, but in reality, it's harder. And so that's why they want to, do shorter rep ranges. Obviously, it shows in the results. You can't be afraid of doing the hard work. You got to do the hard work. There's no way to, hack your way to like a good physique or hack your way into a muscular body. You have to do the work. You can't be afraid of the work. You can't hack your way into it. And then number 5, I would say, just don't have such a large ego. I've had so many people, I've had like skinny people, like fat people with no muscle. They always come to me and they tell me, this is what, it's all about calories in, calories out. You gotta train your biceps. You can't skip biceps, or, whatever I tell them, they'll just tell me it's wrong, or, it's not good. It's not optimal. Listen, man, you can't have this kind of ego, especially when, you haven't built up your body. You don't have any experience. Yeah, I understand, science tells you this, but science is not reality, man. A lot of times it's far from it, especially when it comes to bodybuilding. And honestly, your ego is going to make it so that not only are you not going to be able to learn anything, but it's going to make it so that you're not going to go anywhere in life. You're just going to be stuck where you are in bodybuilding and, in everything else as well. So, drop the ego, do the hard work, be more willing to learn instead of being more willing to judge. That way you'll be more perceiving, you'll absorb more useful information, and you can filter out garbage better. Anyways, guys, with that being said, that's going to bring us towards the end of this video. Let me know what you guys think. Do you follow scientific studies, or do you usually just follow conventional methods and do what works best for you? Let me know, how successful you've been. Also, let me know any thoughts, questions in the comments below. Drop the video a like if you did. Subscribe if you're not already. I'll see you in the next one.